We are in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Sharon, I was thinking this morning, just a reminder, because I use a lot of Wearsby references, Wearsby comments. It's because, Sharon, I'm kind of following his guide as we go through 1 Samuel. So Warren Wearsby's commentary. 1 Samuel chapter 15. You know, this is a pivotal chapter in the story of Saul. The Lord gives him another opportunity to prove himself. The sad part about it, he failed again. He failed again with this second opportunity. Wearsby makes a comment. He says, Saul has a habit of substituting saying for doing, and of making excuses instead of confessing his sins. Ever been around anyone that made a habit of saying and not doing? I had a guy tell me once, don't do what I do what I say. Because what do we normally do? We see what somebody is doing, and that's what we kind of tend to mimic. But Saul had a problem. He didn't walk the walk and talk the talk. And for sure, when there was obvious sins, he did not confess. And we're gonna see that today. No matter what happened with Saul, it was always someone else's fault. No matter what happened. Another Wearsby's comment. Seemed as if Saul was more concerned about looking good before other people rather than being good before God. Kind of that influence from the world he was more concerned about how the world looked at him than how God looked at him. And that's always a choice that we make. That's always a temptation we have, and always a choice that we make, is to want to make sure that we're looking, that relationship with God is the most important, irregardless of what the people around us perceive or think. Verse 1, chapter 15. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint your king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message of the Lord. Verse 2, the Lord said, I'm going to punish the Amalekites because they waylaid, in my 2011 NIV, and I'm in 15 chapter 2, they waylaid Israel when they came out of Egypt. What semantic do you use instead of waylaid? They waylaid Israel when they came up out of Egypt. Chapter 15, verse 2. Obstructed, they kept them from doing what they wanted to do. I've got stopped, interpreted, detained, obstructed. Bob, it's kind of the same thought. Verse 3. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and this is important. Totally destroy all that belongs to them. Totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Amalekites, descendants of Esau. They were enemies of the Jewish people. Some of the commentaries I looked at called them troublesome neighbors. One of the other commentaries I looked at called them just a band of guerrilla terrorists. And God had declared perpetual war against the Amalekites. Exodus 17, verse 16. The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. A perpetual battle going on with the Amalekites. They were extremely wicked, corrupt, idolatrous. They wanted to exterminate the Jews. They were an enemy of the Jews. Verse 4, Saul mustered his army at Telaim, about 210,000 strong. But Saul showed some compassion on the Kenites because they had showed kindness to Israel when they came up out of Israel. Chapter 15, verse 6. Saul told him, you need to go away. You need to get out of here, because verse 7, Saul attacks the Amalekites. Verse 9. But Saul and his army, and catch this, but Saul and his army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Wiersbe asked a good question. He says, but if the Lord says something is condemned, how can we say it's best? How can we say it's good? And that's what Saul chose to do. Well, we can't. If God says it's condemned, it can't be good. It can't be the best. Again, Saul made a choice to go against what has specifically been communicated to him from the Lord. Verse 10 and 11. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. And Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Again, Saul had been given another chance, and he failed miserably. And in verse 12 is just kind of another indication of this ongoing struggle that Saul had with pride. Verse 12. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel, where he has set up a monument in his own honor, and turned and gone down to Gilgal. Saul pridefully set up a monument in his own honor. That's pretty prideful, isn't it? That is pretty prideful. Of course, Saul didn't give up. He lies to Samuel. Verse 13, I have carried out, when Saul is confronted by Samuel, he said, verse 13, I've carried out the Lord's instructions. And Samuel asked a good question. He said, well, why do I hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle? If you were told to completely destroy, why do I hear sheep bleating and cattle lowing? Well, more blame. Saul just immediately, the soldiers, they brought them from the Amalekites, and they're the ones that spared the best of the sheep and the cattle for sacrifices. Verse 15. Again, Saul is always blaming somebody else. It's always somebody else's fault. Verse 16. What do you do? Verse 16. What do you do to somebody that's a perpetual liar, that's a perpetual blamer? How do you handle that? If you know that person is guilty of telling lies after lies after lies, if that person is guilty of blaming over and over, what do you do?
You don't believe him.
For one thing, you don't believe him. I'm sorry, Ed.
Sounds like a president.
Oh, sounds like something that we get into with politics sometimes. After a while, you just don't believe him. Well, Samuel had a good way to handle that. He just said what? Verse 16. Stop. Your versions might said enough. Samuel just couldn't take that anymore. My footnotes had a good point. Selective obedience is just another form of disobedience, because that's what Saul was guilty of. kind of did what the Lord said, but not completely. So selective obedience is just another form of obedience. I look back in the King James, and instead of saying enough or stop, it says stay. It seems as if Saul was maybe trying to turn and run away, or trying to just turn his back on what Samuel had to say. I think that's pretty graphic, though, when you just cut somebody off and say, stop. I've had enough. Stop. I don't want to hear it. Stop. You know, enough of this. That's not the truth. So Samuel continues on. He said, let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And of course, Saul says, I get those two mixed up, too many S's. Saul says, well, tell me, what else could he say after somebody told you that, hey, the Lord and I had a conversation about you last night? Well, he certainly wanted to know. Let's just read through verses 17 through 19. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, although you were once humble, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he, God, sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why? Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? Is that not a pretty stern rebuke? You know, seem like he ought to be getting the message, but Saul just would not. He just would not give up. Verse 20. He says, but I did obey the Lord. Of course, he's talking to Samuel. I went on the mission that the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, the king. Now, how can you completely destroy, and in the same sentence, how can you completely destroy and then bring back at the same time? You know, that was one of Saul's troublesome spots. It was duplicity. He'd say one thing and say another thing that directly opposed each other, and it made sense in his mind. Duplicity, more deceit, more description. This one I want to spend a little time with. My footnotes says, dishonest people soon begin to believe the lies they construct around themselves, and they lose the ability to tell the difference between truth and lies. Have you ever been around anyone that perpetual liar that they completely lost touch with what they had said? They couldn't keep up with their own. I'm seeing some, and you know, that's the kind of guy you want to, when he opens his mouth, just, whoa, stop. Whoa, I've had enough, because again, you don't trust what that person is saying.
He said, but was what he would always have but something else.
Francis he always had an excuse, could not face the reality of what he had done. Great point. More blaming, more lies, verse 21. The soldiers took sheep, cattle, plunder, the best, so they could sacrifice. He's trying to make excuses for what he's done. God will surely, if I'm going to make sacrifices with it, he'll let me have this partial obedience.
There's one thing, I don't know if your version is this way, but he says, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God.
Oh, I didn't catch it. That's good.
With at Gilgal. And I don't guess he's buying into the fact that God is his God and Samuel's God too. At this point.
Isn't that so typical of Saul? Even questioning whether it was God or your God or my God, as if there's a difference. What's that, Ed? I think that was his tendency, Ed, was to put a little light on. I mean, anybody that would build a monument to itself, anybody that would build a monument, you got to think that they were making themselves equal with whatever they worshiped, whatever they praised. I couldn't agree anymore. Samuel's reply, verse 22 and 23. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. There's at least 10 other verses, and I didn't try to capture all of those that tell directly that God wants you to obey. He doesn't necessarily want your sacrifice. He does want your sacrifices, but he wants you to obey first. I thought about Psalms 51:17. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, because God wants obedience. You think Saul's spirit, his heart, was really broken? Do you think his heart was contrite? And I looked up the definition of contrite: feeling or expressing remorse or penitence affected by guilt. Do you think Saul felt guilty?
He may have felt it, but he didn't act on it.
I agree. If he did feel it, we don't see it, do we? He didn't. He failed. That's a Helen great point. He failed to act on it, because immediately, verse 24, more blame. Well, I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. Now we're talking about the king. I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. Verse 25, 26. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back to me. And this is Saul talking. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back to me, so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king. You know, back in chapter 13, verse 14, Saul had forfeited due to disobedience. Remember, he's the one that offered the sacrifices. He had forfeited his dynasty. Now, today, we see that he loses his throne. Of course, Samuel turns to leave. Enough, stop. He's getting out of there. I'm not going to go back with you. Saul grabs a hold of his coat and tears a piece of his coat off. And Samuel uses that as an object lesson. Just as you tore my robe, God has torn the kingdom from you, verse 28, and given it to one better than you. And then he makes this wonderful reference to God. He calls him the glory of Israel. Isn't that a wonderful way to think of God, the glory of Israel? He's made up his mind, and once God has made up his mind, he's not going to change it. Saul replied, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people, and therefore Israel, come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Again, Wiersbe makes a comment. He said Saul was again more worried. Saul was more worried about maintaining his reputation than getting right with the Lord. He was more worried, concerned about how people were looking at him than how God was looking at him. Last part of verse 33. Because Samuel didn't go back to help Saul's pride. Samuel went back to finish the job. Last part of verse 33. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord in Gilgal. He finished the job that Saul should have done. Public execution. He butchered Agag. Well, the two part their ways, each goes to their homes. Samuel goes to Ramah, Saul to Gilbeth. Verse 35, Samuel never went to see Saul again, though Saul mourned for him. And the word mourn means you're mourning like someone has passed away. You're in that deep kind of mourning, like somebody has died, somebody has passed away. Verse 35, the last part. And the Lord regretted, again, the Lord regretted he had made Saul king over Israel. Saul had a wonderful opportunity to, if you will, redeem himself to the Lord. And he failed miserably.
When God see that, when God's on hold. Put Saul in the first place. I don't understand that exactly. That makes God look like a real man. Because I'm sorry, I really meant, I thought he would do what I think. Seems like it's wrong.
Ed asked a great point. He said, seems like God would know Samuel's demeanor, the things that he battled. So you wonder why he put him there, and he kept, and Ed, I'll add my words, kept putting up with him. Ron? And we have that today, don't we? Ron said he might be an object lesson to a lot of other people, and I'm going to inject including us today. And that's why we study. That's why it's so important to go back and look at the life of Saul again. We need to. Ed, I know that our God is long suffering. Thank you. Thank you for being long suffering, putting up with me. And I always love Dale's thought. He's long suffering. He's willing to suffer long for people that he created, for people that he loved. And God wants the best. He wants us to do our best. And I don't know, always seems like gives us another chance up to a point. And then I regret that I've made you king, right?
Also thinking that the Lord said there, the same will start with the people rejected me wanting a king.
That's true. That's true. There was a lot of rejection going on about that time, right? And Saul was rejected. He was rejecting the Lord. A lot of emotion going on at that time.
Sometimes you gotta be careful what you pray for. You might get it.
I know that's true about patience because good Lord, but Ron's thought was you got to be careful what you pray for, because sometimes God gives us what God answers that prayer and gives us what we want, and sometimes it comes with sometimes it comes with some consequences, doesn't it, Ron? I know it has in my life. Yes, DeWan.
Likewise, God tolerated David, but he drew the line about allowing David to build a temple.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I think David is a man after God. And we're going to talk a whole lot about David, man after God's own heart. But yet, when you look at David's life, there were some bumps. There were some pretty significant bumps. But God knew David. He knew his heart. He knew, as some of David's thoughts are expressed in the Psalms, he repented. He said he was sorry. He kept wanting that relationship with the Lord. Yeah.
God is willing to work with man to a certain point, but it says that God is long suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all shall come to a supply. And we don't understand how God works in that way, but he gives us every opportunity and every chance to do his will, which is the true, the best to do. But man is stubborn. Man feels like when God blesses him, he's got the arm of God with him. But he starts thinking that he can make decisions that don't necessarily agree with God. And that was a strong thing. Whenever you tell me to go out and kill babies and kill everybody and everything, then you say, well, what about this? What about that? If I dedicate it to the Lord, maybe he'll accept that instead. But God's word is sovereign, no matter what. And we've got to learn to live in accordance with his will and not think that we think the way he thinks, because he tells us, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. And we sometimes get real mixed up about that.
Oh, I think some of us can identify with Saul when we talked about the partial obedience. You know, because there's some things that we see, you know, when God said completely destroy, completely to kill everything, including men, women, cattle, sheep, everybody. Yeah, that's pretty.
Totally destroy it all.
But that's not our place, Ed, to challenge that is. Our place is to faithfully obey, just to faithfully obey. Wow. Let's get into 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16. Has anybody been disappointed by a close friend or a family member? I think most of us have. If so, then you will understand why Saul mourned so long for Saul. It hurts. It's painful. Samuel must have felt like a dismal failure as a father figure to Saul, as a spiritual leader to Saul, and as a mentor to Saul. Chapter 16, verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. In spite of how Saul felt about himself, in spite of how Saul felt, in spite of how Samuel felt about himself, in spite of how Samuel felt about Saul, God said, hey, I've got work for you to do. Fill your anointing flask and be on your way. God had made a choice. Go to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. Verse 2, you kind of look at verse 2 and it kind of makes you think like Samuel feared Saul, that Samuel feared for his life. And we do know that their relationship was estranged. We do know that Saul had lost the kingdom. And Wiersbe makes a comment. He says, Saul was a suspicious man, and his spies would report everything Samuel did. You think Saul was a suspicious man? I looked that definition up. Suspicious. Having or showing a cautious distrust for someone or something. You think Saul was suspicious? I mean, he had just lost his kingdom. His men had just turned against him and chose Jonathan. He was prideful. He was power hungry. He was threatened, rejected. Yeah, there was probably a good reason that he was suspicious, and that he would probably. Why would somebody spy? Why would somebody like a king spy on different people like he would spy against Samuel? Well, he wanted to know what was going on.
I wonder if Saul's tormenting spirit would be today considered paranoia.
Well, that is, I think,
Well, Saul was told the kingship's taken away from him. So he was doing, I mean, he got really suspicious about what was going on, how he going to lose it. And, you know, he became very suspicious of everybody because he was losing control. And he was a control freak. He liked the control. And whenever somebody tells you, yeah, I'm taking it away from you, you want to know what's going on.
yeah, and I think even to the point where you would be paranoid. I think paranoid about everything, paranoid about anything. So I agree. Yeah. He was, that's where Saul was at this point in his life. Due to his own fault.
Yeah.
Due to what he had done or what he hadn't done, he was a little bit, and I like your words, Sharon. I think he was a little bit paranoid about everything. Plus the fact that David, if you look on the map, Samuel, boy, if you look on the map, Samuel had to go right by Gibeah to go to Bethlehem. And who was at Gibeah? Saul. And so it would have been pretty easy for Saul to kind of spy on Samuel as he went to Bethlehem. Well, God's plan: take a heifer and announce a fellowship offering in Bethlehem, and that ought to put some of Saul's fears at ease. Verse 3: invite Jesse, and then I'll show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicated. Verse 4: when he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? So why were the elders in Bethlehem, why did they tremble at Samuel's arrival, with Samuel coming to Bethlehem? Why would they tremble?
Samuel's with God, and they're about to be visited by Samuel, who has God on his side. So anything they've done or not done will be known.
That's a great point. Now we know that Samuel did not have Saul on his side, but Samuel had God on his side, and that's how he reassured them. Ed, he said, "I come in peace. I come to make a sacrifice." Verse 5: Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord." Saul said, "So you need to spend some time." Of course, he's talking to Jesse. You need to spend some time to consecrate yourself before making a sacrifice to the Lord. When you consecrate, you do that in two different ways. You do it inwardly through some kind of purification ceremony, some type of internal cleansing, if you will. There's typically some kind of sin, some kind of transgression. And when you approach God, you need to have a pure heart through confession, forgiveness, sacrifice. Anything that would contaminate one's relationship with the perfect God needed to be purified before you go before the Lord in sacrifice. That's why Samuel said you need to consecrate yourself. And then you also need to prepare yourself externally. Israel would become unclean for a lot of different reasons: eating certain foods, giving birth, dealing with diseases, touching a dead person. Again, some kind of purification ceremony was needed. Wiersbe adds a neat thought. He said, up into all that Samuel might have meant was you just need to take a bath and wash your clothes. You just need to take a bath and wash your clothes. Verse 5: then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. I don't think Jesse and his sons had any idea of what was going on, because Samuel makes his first pick, and that's Jesse's oldest son, Eliab. Of course, David is still in the fields tending sheep. verse 7. We're in chapter 16, verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not. Now, Samuel has just looked at the oldest son, Eliab. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I think that's a good warning for us, because we kind of go with what we can see sometimes. And when we see that this person has this good appearance, we kind of tend to think well of him, but God looks at the heart. How do we look at the heart? For one thing, we don't look at it like God looks at it, but we do. We look at the heart. How do we look at the heart? Ed, we kind of sit back and we kind of, God immediately knows the heart, but it takes us a little while, because we've kind of got to sit back and watch this guy's actions, what he says, what he does. If he does what he says, and Jim, did you have a comment? Okay, just how else do we watch somebody's heart?
Their actions, everything they can be really what they do, what they say.
And I think that is the most obvious, but I think we can, hey, just talk to somebody. You've been around this person. How is he? I mean, there's some good community, because if a person is good and has that good heart, let me tell you, you ask somebody else about it and what, they will tell you. And typically they'll tell you if they don't have that good kind of heart. They might be physical, they might have a very bright physical appearance, but that heart kind of comes out in a lot.
Reputation. The reputation.
Oh yeah, Francis, that's a better word. Their reputation. Yeah, what is it? The old saying, it follows us, Francis. Our reputation follows us. So we know about.
That takes time. God knows it right away.
And that's the beautiful part about what was told to Samuel. God knows right away, and it kind of takes us a little while to kind of do some follow-up and find out about, but it's worth our time. We need to be sure that we're looking at both the external and maybe more importantly, obviously more importantly, the internal. Saul had fooled Samuel by just looking at the external. Verse 10, Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. Verse 11. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons that you have? There is still the youngest son, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. Got a good question for you. And I didn't go in Wiersbe just brings out some great points. First Chronicles chapter 2 lists Jesse's 7 sons, including David, whereas 1 Samuel 16 lists Jesse's 8 sons, including David. So what happened to the other son? First Chronicles 2, 7 sons, including David. 1 Samuel 16, 8 sons, including Samuel. What happened to the other son? Well, I'm going to go with Wiersbe's. He's a great historian. In those days, when a son dies without issue, when someone dies, a child dies naturally, then they're not included in the genealogy anymore. That was typical for people. If you're kind of reading one number in this chapter and another number in this chapter, the logical answer might have been he just passed away naturally, just passed away normally. Because at that time, in those days, if someone passed away naturally without issue, he kind of dropped out of the genealogy.
And without issue means without children.
Without it, I found it to be naturally that if you didn't have an issue when you passed away, but that's another spin, Jim.
Yeah, I can spin that way.
Okay. Jim, you're a good spinner, buddy. You make us think. Verse 12. So Samuel sent for him, David, and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, arise and anoint him. This is the one. Well, somewhat of a secret service, secret ceremony, Samuel anoints David in front of his 7 brothers. How old was David at the time? At this time? I asked that question and kind of had to back into it a little bit. 2 Samuel 5:4, David was 30. 2 Samuel 5:4, David was 30 years old when he became king. And verse 3 said king over Israel, and he reigned 40 years. So according to Jewish history, not biblical history, but Jewish history, David would have been somewhere around 8 to 15 years old when he was first anointed, 8 to 15 years old. So he had to wait another 15 to 22 years before he became king over all of Israel. So David was first anointed 8 to 15. Any way you go, that's at a pretty young age. Any of your thoughts? Obviously, first bell, we're gonna stop right there. Any of your thoughts? Well, let's pick up next week. We'll finish 16 and hopefully get into chapter 17 next week. Enjoyed the class. Enjoyed your comments. Thank you.
Thanks.